Blood under your fingernails washes out eventually. The smell of cheap copper and cordite doesn't. You come home expecting the soft, sweet scent of your Omega nanny, the quiet hum of cartoons, a fleeting refuge from the cartel wars tearing up the city. Instead, you walk into the basement playroom and see your 7-year-old twins learning how to silently rupture a man's trachea. This isn't a nursery anymore. It's a Black Ops training camp, and the frail boy you hired to scrub your floors is the drill sergeant. Conrad pushed the heavy oak front door shut. It clicked with the finality of a vault. He stood in the foyer of his own home, dripping rain and exhaustion onto the imported marble tiles. His left shoulder throbbed where a ricochet had grazed the Kevlar 3 hours ago. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a hollow, scraping fatigue. He unholstered his weapon, dropped the magazine into his palm, and cleared the chamber. The metallic clack echoed too loudly in the cavernous hallway. Home. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. A sprawling, sterile fortress in the hills, paid for in blood and extortion. He stripped off his soaked leather jacket, letting it fall to the floor. The housekeeper could get it tomorrow, or maybe Rowan would. Rowan. Just thinking the name made the tightness in Conrad's chest ease by a fraction of a millimeter. Rowan was the Omega maid he had hired 6 months ago. Before Rowan, the house had been a war zone of a different kind. Liam and Toby, Conrad's 7-year-old twins, had chased off 3 nannies in a month. They were feral, angry little things, deeply scarred by the car bomb that had taken their mother 2 years prior. They bit, they screamed, they broke things. Then came Rowan, skinny, pale, dressed in oversized knit sweaters that hid his collarbones and scent glands. He had showed up from a second-rate domestic agency, smelling faintly of chamomile tea and unscented bleach. Conrad had given him a week, max. But Rowan hadn't run. Rowan had simply absorbed the twins' chaos. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He possessed a terrifying, bottomless patience. Within a month, the boys were eating their vegetables. Within 2, they stopped throwing glass against the walls. The house smelled of baking bread and quiet compliance. Conrad paid him triple the agency rate, asked 0 questions about the faint, silvery scars on the Omega's wrists, and went back to running his syndicate. Conrad rolled his neck, listening to the vertebrae pop. It was 2 a.m. He was back from Chicago a day early. The house was entirely dark. The HVAC system hummed, pushing cold, filtered air through the vents. He started down the hall toward his study, wanting a heavy pour of scotch before he dragged himself upstairs to check on the pups. But as he passed the grand staircase, his boot stopped mid-step. Alpha senses are blunt, primitive instruments. They don't process nuance, they process threat. The hairs on Conrad's forearms stood up. There was no smell of chamomile. The usual soft, soothing pheromones that Rowan deliberately leaked to keep the house calm were entirely absent. Instead, the air in the east wing carried a sharp, metallic tang. Ozone, burnt sugar. The unmistakable scent of an Omega under intense, focused stress. Conrad's hand instinctively drifted back toward his empty holster before he caught himself. He gritted his teeth, angry at his own paranoia. "It's my house," he told himself. "The security system is green. The perimeter is locked." Still, he moved silently, heel to toe, distributing his weight on the edges of his boots. He tracked the scent down the corridor, past the library, toward the solarium that had been converted into the boys' playroom. A faint light bled from under the double doors. Conrad crept closer. He expected to find Rowan stress cleaning. Maybe the Omega suffered from insomnia. Maybe one of the boys had wet the bed. He pressed his ear against the frosted glass. No sound of scrubbing, no running water, just a steady, rhythmic clicking. Wood on wood, a soft exhalation of breath. Then a voice, Rowan's voice. Too slow, Toby. If you hesitate on the pivot, your center of gravity shifts. He takes your legs, you die on the floor. Reset. Conrad froze. The air left his lungs. Liam, Rowan's voice came again, devoid of its usual melodious warmth. It was flat, clinical. Stop looking at his hands. Watch the collarbone. The collarbone always moves before the strike. Again. Conrad pressed his palm against the glass. The heavy wood of the door felt icy. He pushed it open, just an inch. The playroom used to be a riot of primary colors. Legos, oversized plush toys, train tracks. All of that had been pushed to the perimeter. The center of the room was dominated by the heavy, interlocking foam mats Conrad had installed for the boys to roughhouse on. Standing in the center of the mats was Rowan. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a tight black tank top, his usually messy hair tied back in a severe knot. His bare arms were corded with lean, functional muscle that his oversized sweaters had perfectly concealed. Circling him were Liam and Toby. They were in their pajamas, flannel bottoms with little rockets on them. But their faces were completely devoid of childish innocence. Their eyes were wide, dilated, locked onto Rowan with predatory intensity. Toby lunged. He didn't throw a clumsy childhood punch. He stepped inside Rowan's guard, dropping his weight, aiming a thick wooden dowel precisely at the Omega's floating rib. Rowan moved with sickening fluidity. He didn't block the strike. He parried it, redirecting Toby's momentum. Rowan's hand clamped down on the boy's wrist, twisting just enough to force Toby to his knees, while simultaneously sweeping a leg out to catch Liam, who was rushing in from the blind spot. Both boys hit the foam mat with a heavy thud. Conrad didn't breathe. He couldn't. "You're telegraphing," Rowan said softly, looking down at the two panting 7-year-olds. "Anger makes you stupid. It makes your blood hot and your muscles tight. You don't fight with anger. You fight with math." Rowan knelt on the mat, crossing his legs. He wasn't even sweating. The harsh overhead fluorescent light caught the sheen of sweat on the boys' faces. "Liam," Rowan said, extending his hand. "Show me the artery." Liam scrambled up. He didn't look tired. He looked hungry. He walked over to Rowan, pressed two small, pale fingers against the side of the Omega's neck. "Carotid," Liam whispered. His voice was steady. 4 pounds of pressure for 10 seconds. "And if you don't have the angle for pressure?" Rowan asked. "A puncture," Toby piped up from the floor, wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve. 2 inches deep, twist the blade so the flesh doesn't close around the wound." "Good," Rowan murmured. He reached out, gently stroking Toby's hair. It was a maternal gesture, deeply ingrained in his Omega biology, yet utterly horrifying in context. "Hydrate, then we practice the zip tie escapes again." 5 minutes. Conrad pushed the door open. The hinges groaned. The reaction was instantaneous. Liam and Toby didn't run to their father. They didn't shout "Daddy." Instead, they immediately fell back, flanking Rowan. Their small hands instinctively dropped to their sides, balancing their weight, scanning Conrad's hands, his waist, his shoulders. They looked at their father, the man who bought them ice cream, who carried them on his shoulders, as a target assessment. Rowan stood up slowly. He didn't flinch. The burnt sugar smell vanished, instantly replaced by a thick, cloying wall of vanilla and lavender. It was a chemical lie, an Omega's defensive mechanism, trying to placate an invading alpha. "Mr. Sullivan," Rowan said. His voice was back to the soft, breathy register he used when pouring coffee. "You're home early." Conrad stepped onto the foam mat. His boots left wet, dirty prints on the pristine surface. He looked at Toby. He looked at Liam. Then, he looked at the wooden dowels scattered on the floor. They weren't just sticks. They were perfectly weighted replicas of combat knives. "Go to your rooms," Conrad said. His voice was a low, vibrating rumble in his chest. It wasn't a request. It was an alpha command, laced with enough dominance to rattle the windows. The boys winced, a biological reaction to the heavy pheromones flooding the room. But they didn't move. They looked at Rowan. Conrad's vision went red at the edges. His own sons were waiting for the Omega's permission. Rowan nodded once. "Go on, boys. Brush your teeth." They scattered, slipping past Conrad like ghosts, utterly silent on the hardwood floors of the hallway. Conrad and Rowan were left alone in the harsh light of the playroom. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Conrad could hear the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked at the maid, really looked at him. The subservient slump in Rowan's shoulders was gone. He stood perfectly balanced, his weight on the balls of his feet. His eyes, usually cast down at the floorboards, were locked directly onto Conrad's. They were a pale, washed-out blue ice, water over gravel. "What?" Conrad started, his voice cracking slightly on the word. He swallowed, forcing the rage down, trying to find a shred of rationality. "What the fuck are you doing to my children?" Rowan calmly walked over to the corner of the room, picked up a discarded towel, and wiped his face. The smell of lavender was fading, replaced by something entirely neutral. "Static electricity, wet stone. I'm teaching them how to survive you," Rowan said. The words hit Conrad harder than the bullet that had grazed his shoulder. He took a step forward, his heavy boots closing the distance between them. He towered over the Omega, using his sheer physical bulk to intimidate. It was a dirty trick, an alpha instinct he usually suppressed. "They are 7 years old," Conrad snarled, the rumble vibrating in his throat. "They are boys. I hired you to read them bedtime stories and make them oatmeal, not to train them like dogs in a pit." Rowan didn't back away. He tilted his chin up, exposing his throat. It was an involuntary Omega submission reflex, but the look in his eyes completely contradicted it. It was active, burning defiance. "You hired me to keep them safe," Rowan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Reading them Goodnight Moon doesn't stop a bullet, Conrad. A warm bowl of oatmeal won't help them slip out of a trunk if your rivals in the Delgado family decide to snatch them off the street. That won't happen. I have security. I have guards at the gate. Guards fall asleep. Guards take bribes," Rowan said, tossing the towel onto a plastic toy chest. "I found 3 blind spots in your perimeter camera network on my second day here. Your head of security smokes cigarettes by the east wall every night at 11:15. For 6 minutes, the entire rear courtyard is unobserved. A decent extraction team could be in and out before he dropped his cigarette." Conrad stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the conversation paralyzed him. This was the boy who blushed when Conrad asked him to pass the salt at breakfast. "Who the hell are you?" Conrad demanded. He reached out, grabbing Rowan by the bicep. The muscle beneath the skin was hard as iron. Rowan looked down at the hand holding him. "Let go of me." "Or what?" Conrad challenged. A bitter, cynical laugh escaping him. "You'll rupture my carotid." "I won't have to. You're bleeding." Rowan nodded toward Conrad's left side. Conrad looked down. The movement had reopened the graze on his shoulder. Blood was seeping through his white undershirt, a dark, spreading stain. Rowan pulled his arm free from Conrad's slackening grip. The Omega stepped closer, violating the personal space boundaries an employee should maintain. He reached out, unzipping the small first aid pouch he kept on his belt. A belt Conrad had always assumed held cleaning supplies. "Sit down," Rowan ordered. "I don't take orders from my maid," Conrad spat, though his knees suddenly felt weak. The adrenaline crash was hitting him all at once. "You're not taking an order from a maid. You're taking it from the person keeping your bloodline alive," Rowan said softly. He pressed a hand against Conrad's good shoulder, pushing him down until the Alpha was sitting on the edge of the foam mat. Rowan knelt beside him, ripping open a sterile gauze pad with his teeth. The smell of copper from Conrad's wound mixed violently with the scent of wet stone coming from Rowan. "You want them to be normal," Rowan murmured, as he pressed the gauze against the wound. Conrad hissed through his teeth. "You want them to play with toy trains. You want to pretend that when you leave this house, you go to a respectable office building, and not a warehouse where people get their teeth pulled." "They don't know what I do," Conrad said stubbornly, staring at the ceiling. "They have eyes, Conrad. They see the guns under the jackets of your friends. They hear the sirens. They know their mother didn't die in an accident. They carry it in their bones. You left them defenseless in a world entirely made of teeth." Rowan taped the gauze down with rough efficiency. He lingered for a moment, his fingers lightly brushing against Conrad's collarbone. A strange, electric jolt traveled through the contact point, confusing Conrad's muddled brain. The Omega was touching him, not with affection, but with clinical ownership. "I am an Omega," Rowan said, leaning in so his breath brushed Conrad's ear. "Biology tells me to nest, to nurture, to protect my pups at all costs.